Onward. Structured decision-making from the state of Michigan with Mary Shalaman and Terry McCoskey.
Good afternoon. As a Children's Protective Services worker in the late 80s, I was constantly plagued with doubt as I made decisions about the safety and risk to children. I lay awake in bed at night, wondering if the child I left with her mother, who swore she was no longer smoking crack, was safe. Was my decision to remove a 2-month-old baby boy with a suspicious arm fracture the right one? What services could I provide to best resolve the problems? How could I prioritize which cases to open for continued services, which to
on crime and delinquency to develop specific assessment tools with related policies to guide worker-supervisor decisions. These tools help workers assess future risk to children and needed services. Agencies throughout the country to review and adopt it within their jurisdiction.
Thank you. Questions? Elizabeth Shore.
If we assume that having a structured decision-making instrument is better than not having one, and if we assume that the instrument that you are using is better or as good as any other that's available, I'm sure you would agree that that's only one part of the problem of making child welfare and child protection and foster care services effective. Could you tell us a little bit about the context in which you're implementing this tool and how it has affected the rest of your work and the other innovations with which you're getting those better results?
If we separate the structure of the assessment tools, it gives rise to questions of skill in making assessments at the various points in the life of a case. What we tried to do in Michigan is put together structure of assessments to assure that every worker, every time in every case, at different points in the life of the case, we're looking at the same kinds of assessment data. And then with the Child Welfare Training Institute, tried to bring together the skill base to appropriately assess at each and implement at each point in the life of the case.
So you're suggesting that assessment is really the nub of all the work that you're doing?
Assessment begins to help triage which cases are most in need of services. Part of the assessment process is what we call the Family Strengths and Needs Assessment that provides a look at a series of life domains for a family, such as substance use, parenting skill, intellectual ability. With that tool, we can help pinpoint which services are most likely to strengthen the family.
It helps to prioritize the services too, because what we found is workers would maybe identify 8 different areas where the family could really use services and inundate a family by demanding that they do A, B, C, D, and E, and the family was overwhelmed and would kind of retreat. And by prioritizing and looking at the top 3 needs in a family, we're able to really get that family, you know, in a position where they can adequately address those major priority needs, and then maybe have their children remain with them safely or have children return home sooner, and then we can address some of the other needs that may not be as much risk to the child if they remain in the home.
Susan Schwab.
This is a program that was established under your previous governor. You have a new governor. I'd be curious as to the current governor's reaction to this, familiarity, and what you think this means for the future of the program.
Well, I think it's going to be looked at. I think that the research that's been done has been very supportive, and I know our new administration at the Family Independence Agency, where, you know, we carry out this plan, has been supportive of it. So I'm hoping that, you know, it will continue, and, you know, we'll be able to actually keep NCCD involved, because we keep revalidating our scales and looking at how our counties are using the structured decision making to make sure that, you know, we don't need to tweak it anywhere.
Does the new governor have a new budget?
Yes.
And how does the budget affect you?
There's been reductions in a lot of areas, but our area with structured decision making has been kept intact. We've been able to keep that on board.
Might also point out that the new director, Nanette Bowler, in the state of Michigan, was the legal advisor to Lieutenant Connie Bensfield's Commission on Children under Governor Engler, and it was Nanette Bowler who helped implement the expansion of structured decision-making through what we call response priority system to help identify which cases to respond to and in what time frame.
Kathleen?
Congratulations. I think it is hard to implement such a large change, and that you've done so much training sounded very innovative and a real commitment, and I was impressed. We tried to do some of the same things in Maryland in juvenile justice, so I was really impressed to hear about that. I was curious if you have found that you know, obviously some of the social workers probably started off saying, I have a better idea about what to do, and whether there are in fact some social workers who are really good and make the decisions all the time, and if they were able to, you would really rather trust them. But given that you can't trust everybody, this is a good tool. Or do you find that everybody needs to need the tool? People who are wise and smart still make better decisions using the tool.
You know, we found some workers who were the seasoned workers who had been making good decisions, you know, reluctantly started using the tool, but found themselves actually somewhat pleased by looking at some of the needs assessments where there were domains that they hadn't thought about. For instance, there was a woman who was clinically depressed, couldn't keep her house clean, child been removed. And one of the things we look at is physical health of the client. And this particular woman had some major physical problems. And the social worker said, I wouldn't have even thought of going there. And once I got her to a doctor and got her physical problem addressed, her depression lifted, and she was able to rebuild her life and get her child back. So, you know, we were able to convert quite a few of those workers who were a little hesitant in the beginning. And it's been a wonderful tool for worker turnover. If a worker leaves, there are certain time frames that are inevitable in the life of the case, and those don't change just because the worker changes, whereas before we would see that constantly happening where a new worker came on and the case started all over again. And so this way there's something built in that you can go from worker to worker without losing some of the progress or lack of progress a family has made.
Susan?
I gather from your comments that it has also given you a tool for measurement that you didn't have before. Is that correct? Because it's consistent? I'm asking more.
That's absolutely true. The data is collected on a case-by-case basis as information is developed. An example of that data would be that for a group of families over time that had substance use as a major problem, we took a look at which families received service for that problem and which families did not. And interestingly, what we found is that those that did not receive service had a re-referral rate at 15%, whereas those who did receive service had a re-referral rate of 8%, a significant difference. And there were a number of reasons why families didn't get referrals. They refused service, they weren't referred in the first place, there weren't services available, but the difference stands.
And at a county level, if we saw that maybe parenting issues were a problem, and we saw a lot of those cases where the child wasn't being returned home, we would look at what service are we providing for parenting, and maybe the service itself isn't addressing the issues that need to be addressed. So it would help us in planning, you know, in our community, what services to approach for families and maybe to design.
But didn't you have that information? I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand what structured decision making has brought versus the old system. I mean, would you not have had that piece of information prior?
It would be hard to extrapolate it, and a lot of it was just long-running narratives by workers, and they wouldn't really hone in on particular problems. And so this way, workers are entering into the computer the top 3 needs for a particular family, and then we're looking at what services are being provided on our service plan. So it's a lot easier to gather that data, plus it's just much more clearly laid out in the service plan for us to be able to extrapolate it.
As we were implementing I was managing one of the pilot sites in Michigan, Macomb County. One of the things we found in the data feedback was that 50% of those in need of parent skill training did not get a referral for parent skill training. We did not have that information from any other source. I sat down with the Children's Protective Service workers and asked the question, why are we not making referrals? Their response was, yes, we have a child or a parent skill training program in Macomb County. However, it's generally a well baby parent skill training. Our families have greater needs. They have more rehabilitative need in parent skill training. They have some very specific deficits, and we feel that our parents who go there feel even embarrassed about some of the issues they have. So we've wind up not making referrals. We then turned to the Michigan Co-op Extension, asked if we could encourage them to develop a response to parent effectiveness training that would meet our family's needs. They did respond, and we significantly lowered that non-referral rate. So the information doesn't really come through as clearly without looking at it on a case-by-case basis.
David Osborne.
You said that many agencies around the country have adopted your approach. Can you give us a ballpark figure, the number of states that have adopted it, the number of counties and states where this is administered on a county level?
A ballpark figure, there are 15 counties on a pilot basis in California, including LA, Orange. There are several states throughout the country, Georgia, Minnesota, New Mexico, Alaska, who are utilizing the structured decision-making case management model. Georgia, Minnesota specifically, and New Mexico in the beginning took the research in Michigan and applied it to their own population, and then later, once implemented, they followed up with validation research in their own sites. California chose to use the Michigan model as its base, but do its own front-end research. So it varies. Colorado, South Australia come to mind. The round figure would be in Wisconsin, Urban Caucus in Wisconsin of 7 counties. So round figure, I would say 15 jurisdictions around the state, around the country, and several counties within those jurisdictions. Cuyahoga County, Ohio.
Is the committee had an excellent evaluator come to the site, Bob Bain, who pointed out to us in the paper that this idea of risk assessment scales for children has been around for some 20 years. Would it be appropriate for us to conclude that the real innovation here is not coming up with a model, but rather the degree of success that you've had in applying the model?
I think quite to the contrary. I think it is the model. The risk assessment, research-based risk assessment tool is quite different than a consensus-based risk tool that has been around for many years. In fact, the consensus-based tools that are out there typically would look at the entire life of a case and all elements around that life of the case, whereas in structured decision-making, we take a look at discrete tools for specific decisions. Safety, for example, at the first contact with the family, we want to know, will the child be safe as the investigation proceeds? Once the investigation goes on, we want to know, what's the likelihood this child will be maltreated again in the future? That drives whether the case gets open and served as compared to perhaps closed at investigation.
Since your argument is contrary to what the evaluators argued, could you tell us, could you help explore this a little more, because it's a critical point. What was the old system compared to the innovation? I don't understand what the old expert system was, because clearly our evaluator thinks they're quite similar.
They're similar in concept. Research that was completed comparing 2 consensus-based models, the Washington State model of risk assessment, the old Fresno model in California, consensus-based of risk assessment, and the Michigan research-based system for risk assessment, took a look at outcomes relative to consistency and validity. Consistency, asking the question, if 4 evaluators looked at the same case scenario, to what degree would those 4 evaluators come to the same conclusion about potential future risk to children? What it found was that in the 2 consensus-based models, if we were going to look at 100% agreement of the evaluators, that would be about 26% agreement with the consensus-based model as compared with 55% with structured decision-making. So then further lowering that test, what about if we expected a 75% agreement? The 75% agreement raised structured decision-making to 86% agreement, whereas the consensus-based models were at 50%.
Let me, from my understanding of the difference between the models, and maybe I was wrong, is that your model was based on testing. If you tested your model to say, is the child safe? And you looked at what you would say, and then you went out into the field and said, was the child in fact safe? It was based on, it was an experiential-based model, as compared to the consensus-based model. This is how I understood it, at least, was that you got about 10 social workers together, and they sat around and they agreed as to what should be done, but they didn't test in the same way that you tested.
The research-based outcome test. That's
right.
correct.
You did the research-based outcome test as
That's right.
compared to the consensus-based model. Is that the distinction? Did I describe it correctly?
Yeah.
No. Yes. Who knows?
No, we need to do that. I'm sorry to be extended here, and we really need to wrap up soon, but I think this is a very sensitive point.
It's a critical point in that the research outcomes do show effectiveness in structured decision-making, whereas there are no similar outcomes of effectiveness with the consensus-based models.
All right.
Did you get it?
I think some of us who are slower here are almost on the train.
And the other distinction is that in structured decision-making, we did separate the tools for different points in the life of the case, rather than to expect all diagnostic information to come in at one time from the assessment perspective, and then decide what a family needs for strengthening.
Good. All right, one last question, one tail-end question.
Question to follow up on what you were asking also, David, and so I understand the before and after, which I think is critical. Before you had this kind of structured decision-making, were there rules about what someone should ask? Was there a list of questions? Was there anything like that? How did a social worker, I'm pretty familiar, at least I know where I come from, how they make their decisions, but what were the guidelines like that they were expected to follow?
There were questions like family functioning. It just said drug use. It was open-ended.
Okay.
There were just blanks that you'd fill in, but there were no critical points where if a family was, partially entered into services and had shown some benefit, and they were visiting their child, what does that mean at 3 months? What does that mean at 6 months? What does a parent who doesn't do anything mean at 3 months and at 6 months? There was absolutely nothing guiding you when you should look at termination. Okay. And it was case by case, worker by worker, judge by judge, and often workers would let the court pretty much overtake their decision-making if they felt intimidated or if they didn't feel confident enough. And this really helped bring up their confidence because there were certain guidelines that they could actually follow, and it kind of removed some of that subjectivity with the parents, even to tell a parent, you left me no choice here. You didn't do what you needed to do. Now we move forward. So it kind of removed some of that onus from only the worker making that recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Mary and Terry, your presentation, I think, suggests to me this. There is a remote possibility that with your program, and this applies to every program, that the committee may have a factual question that it needs to resolve sometime during its deliberations, and perhaps if you all could each of you could let the organizers know how you might be reached by phone as the day goes on, that would be most helpful to us. I think it's conceivable we're going to be into some conversations among ourselves that we're going to have a factual follow-up that we'd just like a brief answer to. So if you would do that. But in the meantime, Mary Shalaman and Terry McCoskey, thank you very much and congratulations.